Hello, everyone. Welcome to another class of your Women in Gender Studies course. I'm your professor, Dr. Maldonado. Let's get started. So this week we'll be going over the constructions of homosexualities. And to start off our discussion, we'll be investigating Alfred Kinsey, Dr. Alfred Kinsey. Now, Dr. Alfred Kinsey was a biologist and essential scientist at Indiana University. He was particularly interested in etymology and how insects reproduce, including their sexual behavior. Now, he was also in charge of teaching a marriage and family class, which was only restricted to juniors and graduating seniors of the university, particularly those who are engaged. Okay. So he quickly found out while he was teaching this class, there's little to no research on sexual behavior. So he signed up for leave and was granted leave and was permitted to conduct research around the United States. However, he primarily patronized bars and clubs in predominantly white college towns. So most of his research findings are based upon middle and upper class, predominantly heterosexual white college students. Now, this is a problem because his findings cannot be generalized to the entirety of the nation or to the entirety of humankind. Why? Because again, the primary demographics of his research sample were upper class and middle class, predominantly white college students, and largely male at that. Not everyone within the United States is male. Not everyone within the United States is heterosexual. Not everyone within the United States is cisgender. Not everyone within the United States is white, right? The United States is composed of folks of various cultural, ethnic, gender, sexual melting pots. Okay? And research, in order to be generalizable, needs to account for that. So even though Alfred Kinsey was a pioneer of sexuality studies research, there are biases and flaws inundated within and throughout his research. Okay. However, it still served as a great starting point for the study of sexuality. So let's get into the specifics here. So, as we mentioned before, he was a biologist, entomologist, and sexologist. He published two foundational books, Sexual Behavior in a Human Male in 1948, which received worldwide acclaim because people were discovering facets and findings about how men comported themselves within the sexual arena. Now, this inspired further interest into what women do, right? Because heterosexual men need sexual experiences with women in order to comprise their sexuality, right? So women were next in line. So he published a book on the sexual behavior in a human female in 1953, okay, which he examined various investigations when it came to how women comported themselves in the sexual arena. Now, he based his findings on over 18,000 sexual history reports around the country from men and from women and made some fascinating findings, which we'll get to in the next slide. So, he is a renowned academic researcher at Indiana University, and there's even a Kinsey Institute, which I have personally been to, and that's located in the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, which is located in Lindley Hall on the third floor. So you can still go there and be able to check out, even borrow materials from the Kinsey Institute. So this is what he found. He found that young Americans were sexually active despite conservative beliefs and values. This was surprising. I know it may seem commonplace today, but back in the mid 20th century, in 1940s and 1950s, this was a shock because the consensus of the United States believed that no one was having sexual relations or even having their first kiss outside of marriage. So these findings were surprising, shocking, and fascinating. He also found that women were having sex before marriage. And lots of it. Oh my gosh, this blew the minds of many civilians around the United States because, again, they believed that women were upholding sexual chastity and values and norms associated with sexual chastity before marriage, right? And even women were having sex with other women, and men were having sex with other men. This was shocking to the United States. Okay. He also found that women have vaginal orgasms in addition to clitoral orgasms. Okay, again, shocking. Not many folks even acknowledged or realized that women were having orgasms or experienced sexual pleasure at all. Again, this knowledge may be seem commonplace today. However, again, back in the 1940s and 1950s, this was shocking, world-rocking news, right? So Americans did not have a universal understanding about sexuality. Okay. So this book, these two books provided the foundation that was critically needed for people to acknowledge and recognize the fact that people were indeed having sexuality and experiencing sexual encounters with one another. So this is the this is the Kinsey scale that he came up with. Now, this may seem convoluted, but I'm going to help you understand. So, this Kinsey scale is a scientific attempt to measure and understand one culmination of sexual experiences, not sexual orientation, and it's based upon participants' anecdotal sexual histories. Now, Kinsey believed that the terms heterosexual and homosexual were better used as adjectives or descriptors of sexual behavior instead of descriptors and indicators of identity. Okay. So for Kinsey, people engaged in heterosexual behavior, people engaged in bisexual behavior, people engaged in homosexual behavior. People were not heterosexual, people were not homosexual, people were not bisexual. However, the behavior that they engaged in, that could be described as heterosexual, as bisexual, etc. Okay, so keep that in mind. Kinsey was not a fan of, okay, let's identify an entire person based upon what they do sexually. Instead, Kinsey believed in, let's define the behavior in terms of heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality. So now let's get into the scale. So here, on this scale, on the left-hand side where you have zero, we're starting at zero, and then we go to the right, zero, one, two, three, four, five, six. Okay? So each of these numbers have a rating. So for zero, that means exclusively heterosexual. You have had no homosexual or and/or same gender encounters ever in your life, right? Because remember, these Kinsey reports were based upon self-reports from participants throughout your whole life. What types of sexual encounters have you had, particularly with whom, right? So zero meant that you had only heterosexual encounters, only. One, no, before we get to one, let's skip all the way to three, okay? So three, which is right in the middle of 2, 1, 0, and right in the middle of 4, 5, 6, three means that you've had an equal number of heterosexual encounters and homosexual encounters. So let's say for three, you've had six partners, six sexual partners in your life. So three of those partners would be men. The other three of those partners would be women. Okay. So you will rank yourself as three on the scale, on the Kinsey scale, if you had an equal amount of men as sexual partners and an equal amount of women as sexual partners. Okay. So let's get back to zero. Now that we know what zero and three means on the scale, let's start from the beginning. So we're starting at zero. Let's say you had six partners, seven partners. All six or seven of those partners are going to be the opposite sex. So let's say that you're a woman. You identify as a woman, and you had seven sexual partners. If you're located at zero, then all seven of those partners will be men. However, let's skip to one. Okay. So one means that you've had primarily heterosexual experiences, but you had one or two or a little amount of homosexual experiences. So let's say you're the same woman with seven sexual partners. Okay. So six of those partners were men. However, one of those partners were women, right? Or even you've had five sexual partners who were men, but two of those sexual partners were women. It's still the majority of opposite sex sexual relationships, opposite gender sexual relationships. So you'll still be rated at one. Now let's move on to two. Okay. Let's say you had more than seven sexual partners. Let's say you had 12 sexual partners and you're rating yourself at a two. Now, two means that you've had many sexual partners with the opposite sex. However, you've also had many sexual partners with the same gender. So now let's say you had 12 sexual partners in total. So let's do eight. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There we go. Let's do eight. Okay. So you're a woman, you've had 12 sexual partners. Eight of those sexual partners are men, whereas, oh, sorry, eight of those sexual partners were women, whereas four of those sexual partners were men. Okay, very, very good. So you have the majority of your sexual partners of the same sex and just a little bit of the same sex, excuse me, same opposite, excuse me, opposite sex sexual partners. Okay, now three, you are at the middle, midpoint. So let's say that you've had 14 sexual partners. Seven of those sexual partners were men, and seven of those sexual partners with women is an equal amount. Now let's get to the four, five, six. But let's skip all the way to six so this can help you make a little bit more sense of the scale. Okay. So starting at six, this means that you've exclusively had homosexual experiences. You've exclusively only had primarily only homosexual, same gender experiences. So let's say that you are a man, okay? If you are a man and you've only had three sexual partners throughout your life, all of those sexual partners were men. Now let's move to five, okay? Five means that you had mostly homosexual experiences, but just a few opposite sex experiences, okay? So let's say you've had six sexual partners throughout your life. Okay. Four of those, let's see here. Yes. Four of those, no, let's do is make it simple. Five of those sexual partners were men, whereas one of those sexual partners were women, right? So mostly homosexual partners and few opposite sex partners. Now we're going to move to four. We're getting close to the midpoint of having equal sexual partners between men and women. So if you're at the four scale, if you're rating yourself as a four, that means you've had mostly homosexual partners, but also many opposite sex sexual partners. Okay. So let's say that you've had 12 sexual partners at four. You've had, let's see here, with 12, that's going to be seven homosexual partners. Okay. Same sex partners. Whereas you've also had five, is that right? The math, right? 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yep. Five opposite sex partners. Okay. For women, right? So you're still more with the opposite sex partners than you started out with five. Okay. So this breakdown on the right-hand side of the screen should help you. And it depends upon how you look at the scale as well. If you're starting from zero, again, exclusively heterosexual, one is mostly heterosexual experiences and few same-sex experiences. Two is mostly heterosexual experiences and many same-sex experiences. Three, you have an equal amount of same-sex experiences and opposite-sex experiences. Four, you've had mostly homosexual experiences and also many opposite-sex experiences. Five, you have mostly homosexual experiences and few opposite sex experiences. And then six is exclusively homosexual. Okay. So these can vary. The scale and the ratings can vary from person to person. And again, the point of this graph is to gauge the sorry, to gauge the sexual behavior of a particular community and or just a particular individual. Now, here's the purpose. You have an empirical starting point for sexuality studies research in a once sexually conservative country, such as the United States. And also, it served as the first empirical instrument developed to understand sexual behavior. Okay. It also provides a viewpoint of a community's or nation's sexual proclivities. It also inspires additional scientific inquiry for gender and sexuality studies research in various directions. So that's the point of the scale and also the point and significance of Alfred Kinsey's research. So, at what point in history did same-sex desire and copulation begin? When did people started being interested in the same gender? When did folks started having same gender sexual intercourse? I'll give you a couple of seconds. Since the beginning of time, okay? Men have been having sexual relationships with other men since the beginning of time. Same thing as women having same gender sexual relationships with other women since the beginning of time. There's no certain start point, okay? So, when it came to the label of homosexuality, that began in Europe in the 19th century. So, in the 1800s, the late 1800s, I believe 1898, there was the label of homosexuality, primarily as a pejorative term in order to label those who were deviating from the cis heteronormative role and norm, right? So that's where the label of homosexuality came from. Someone is homosexual. Okay. So now, when we examine sexuality within a cross-cultural context, we can consider African nations, Indian Hydras, Greco-Roman societies, and Latin men. Now, African nations, there was this emphasis on behavior and not identity. Sexual relationships that were between the same gender have been happening again since the beginning of time, even on the continent of Africa. Okay. So we have the concept of boy wives, mommy baby relationships, and Bagbaru. So with boy wives, only men with when you consider polygamous relationships were primarily practiced with men who had financial means. So only men of wealth, men who have money can have multiple wives. However, men who lacked financial wealth, who lacked financial stability, who had little to no money, could not afford girls and women to marry. They can only afford boys to marry, who they would then dress the boys up, and or the families of the boys would dress the boy up as a girl to enact and perform femininity, okay, in order to appease the older man who lacked financial resources. So men weren't provided with the privilege to marry girls and or women because they lacked money, okay? So that's where we have the concept of boy wives, where that comes from. And when that boy grew up, he either chose to remain partnered with his husband and or proceeded to earn his own means to financial wealth and financial prosperity, and then to have a wife of his own. Okay, so these relationships between older men and younger boys weren't necessarily permanent. There were some transients pertaining to that. Okay. Mommy baby relationships, that was relationships between older girls and younger girls where they will play the role as husband and wife or as wife and wife, depending upon how they wanted to queer those gendered concepts between them in terms of romantic and or sexual relationships. But these relationships were primarily among young girls under the age of 18, where older girls and or older adolescents with partner become girlfriends with younger prepubescent girls, okay, in order to enact partnership that mimicked these marital roles in adulthood, okay? And then we have Indian Hydras. Now, Indian Hydras are also known as someone who is of the third sex. Okay. Now, Hydras have a contentious history within the society of India, where Hydras were once well wide renowned and cherished spiritually within various spiritual systems. However, in recent and contemporary times, their presence, their notoriety has dwindled due to the colonization of India into the outlawing of folks identifying as transgender and or the third sex. So many Indian Hydras have been succumbed to sexual violence and also engaging in sex work in order to make ends meet because they have been outcasted by colonized Indian society. Okay. So there is a contentious history when it comes to Indian Hydras. And many Indian Hydras are those who are born of the male, who are those who are assigned of the male sex. However, they live and comport themselves within the feminine manner as women. Okay. And many partner with men. Many Indian Hydras have been also castrated as well, having their genitals removed, particularly their testicles, in order to prevent the onset of testosterone. Okay. So those are the cultural iterations that you can dichotomize between the African nations and Indian Hydras. Now, when we come to investigate Greco-Roman society and Latino men, we have this concept of pederasty. Now, pederasty was this concept and phenomena where older established men in politics would take on a younger boy who served as a mentee to the mentor, the older male mentor. Okay. And it often included these relationships that were often sexual in nature, whereas the older man would engage in procural sex with younger boys. And procural sex is a fancy phrase for the man is attempting or playing as if they are penetrating the young boy. However, no penetration is actually occurring, quote unquote, right? But when you're behind closed doors and considering the privacy that's allotted to men, there were likely definitely a penetration going on between these older men and young boys. Okay. So older men, they were responsible for enacting the insertive role. Okay. Because when you are the one doing the inserting, you are seen as a man, where if you're the one receiving the penetration or receiving the insertion, you are seen as the woman in the relationship. And we went over that in our previous lecture when it comes to masculinity. Okay. So we're going to skip over masculine restraint because we're going to go over that in another lecture and go to the preservation and interpretation of lesbian sex. Now, lesbian sex in Greco-Roman times was not given the importance as it should have been. Many records when it came to lesbian stories, relationships, and sex were destroyed, annihilated, forgotten, not taken seriously because women liked the penis. And back in Greco-Roman times, if a human lacked a penis and they were not a man, they were seen as less than, i.e., women. However, you do have some preserved records when it comes to the island of Sappho's, where Sappho's was this realistic and mythical figure of a woman who likely, as we understand today, identified as lesbian, lived a lesbian lifestyle, etc., where she had relationships, romantic and sexual relationships with women. Okay. And there was an island supposedly of women who had romantic and sexual relationships with other women, right? So there are records preserved of the island of Sapphire. All right. So when we come to Latin men, I will go over that in another lecture. So stay tuned. So let's get into the intersection of gender and sexuality. We'll be examining the concept of masculinity. Now, masculinity is known in Western traditions associated with the male sex, the gender of man, boy, etc. Okay? Now, masculinity comprises characteristics such as active, independent, and unemotional. Let's get into how masculinity functions when it comes to this overarching system, patriarchy. So here's our handy dandy privilege, oppression, and discrimination map. As you see here, patriarchy, which means male rule, domination of men, okay? Masculinity, which is not depicted here, is a byproduct of patriarchy. Folks often engage in what's conceived as masculine concepts, behaviors, ideals, characteristics, etc., such as to uphold the system of patriarchy and to separate men from women and men from other genders and males from other sexes. So I want to go over this handy dandy paint demonstration with you. I enjoy using paint because it helps me illustrate my point. So here you have patriarchy. Okay, so let me draw a shape. Here you have this overarching system of patriarchy. Also, you have the byproduct. That's not what I want to use. You have the byproduct of masculinity as well. Now, masculinity
It is precarious, meaning it has these precarious, dubious borders around masculinity that has little slits and divots and points of entry, unsecure points of entry. But in totality, generally, these points of masculinity, the parameters of masculinity, are quite surrounded by the enforcers of patriarchy, the protectors of patriarchy, the protectors of this concept called masculinity. There's typically a force surrounding this concept of masculinity in order to protect it from being co-opted. Okay. And just imagine that these forces are all over this space. Okay. So it's not just this one line around, it's all over. However, you have some men and two-spirit and everybody else, and women, etc., girls, boys, even men themselves, who try to come in and wiggle their way through, fight these enforcers, and penetrate this sphere, this supposedly impenetrable sphere of masculinity in order to co-opt pieces of masculinity and take it with them to somewhere else, wherever that somewhere else may be, right? And then you have this concept called femininity, okay? Which is the complete antithesis of masculinity. Now, here's the thing. I'm gonna use a different color. Masculinity, because it's associated with patriarchy and upholding the patriarchy thereof, it's on this pedestal, so to speak. So the higher you are on this pedestal, the more masculine you are, i.e., the more privileged you are. And being privileged, people like being privileged because you get those unearned societal benefits. You don't have to work for those, they're just given to you. Whereas the further you stray from masculinity, conceptions thereof, let's say you're down here somewhere. That's where people tend to experience in terms of gender and sex, and also how gender, sex is informed and compounded by other identities such as age, ethnicity, class, etc. Again, sexism and heterosexism can be compounded by those things, right? Intersectional oppressions, intersectional privileges. And when anyone faces oppression and marginalization, that's not a good thing because that means you are being deprived of resources that should be automatically granted to you within the equal and equitable society. So the further you stray from this concept of masculinity, the less privileged you are, the more marginalized you are, the more oppressed you are. So this is what some people do. Some people, including men, including boys, including girls, including trans folks, including everyone, they will come out the woodwork wherever they are that's furthest away from masculinity or kind of in the middle, etc. And they will fight through their way to get past the enforcers and get into this sphere of masculinity, play on this playground of privilege of being masculine and come right back out, okay? They may or may not take something with them. That something may be the experience of privilege, etc., experiences, and probably tokens of privilege that they can take and share with their more marginalized communities, okay? So this just goes to show you that these boundaries of masculinity are not necessarily fortified as much as the patriarchy thinks it is, okay? So make sure to keep that in mind, that masculinity is this permeable, it's this fluid concept that is also subject to change, that is also fluid, such as with femininity, characteristics associated with women, girls, the female sex, etc., also fluid, also ever changing by space, region, culture, and time. These things, these concepts are not fixed, right? So there's this constant switching, whether you're coming from masculinity, whether you're coming from androgyny, whether you're coming from femininity. Folks are going in between these spheres and also existing. Let me do it down here. You're also existing in between these spheres as well. Let's call this in masculinity. Let's call this in femininity in terms of binaries. Androgyny exists right here in the middle where folks can exist right in between those extremes and or experience the privilege of shifting in between these extremes. So you might be here in February, but you're over here in December, right? Or you're right back here in March. So just keep that in mind. These things are not, these concepts such as masculinity, femininity, androgyny are not fixed. They can be performed by anyone in any way for a variety of reasons, okay? So I'm going to show you how sexuality is also queered, can also be queered, how masculinity can also be queered by sexuality, okay? So let's get into it. So how does masculinity connect to queer sexuality? How can masculinity be queered by queer sexuality? So there's this concept called self-control. Self-control is key to living a prosperous life, a productive life. You must always have self-control. And this was a motto that the Romans and the Greeks championed for, okay? Now, many people often reference Greco-Roman culture because a lot of folks are huge fans of this highly preserved history, etc., etc. But what people don't know is that the Greeks got all of their influence when it comes to mythology, when it comes to spirituality, customs, mores, ways of life from the Egyptians. Okay. So the Greeks went over to Egypt, saw how the African Egyptians were living. It's like, we like this. Let's take some of these things and make it our own. So they took all of these religions and spiritual systems and writings and poetries and arts and made it their own. Then the Romans came in, looked at what the Greeks were doing, bastardized it and made it their own, etc., etc. Christians came in, then everything else came in, and people typically only associate history, like, how can I say this? Associate the majestics of history with Greco-Romans. However, this one little important detail is often left out. The Greeks and the Romans got everything from the Egyptians. Okay, so like I said last, the further back in history you go, the blacker it gets. So here's this concept called self-control. There's these iterations of political, financial, emotional, and sexual self-control. Here's the thing. A man is considered a man if they have self-control, particularly layers, specific layers of self-control. Now, everything starts out in the private sphere. One of the mottos of feminism is that the personal is political. So how a person behaves in private is more than likely how they behave in public across a variety of domains and realms. So if a man was known to have a lot of sex, just promiscuous, didn't matter if it was sex with adults, sex with minors, sex with wives, sex with men, etc., that was too much. Too much as in, if you're having way too much promiscuous sex, you have no self-control. That means that you will likely have no self-control over your emotional state. Okay, so this is working backwards here. Let's throw sexuality into this. So if a man was having promiscuous sex with a lot of women, where he is the penetrator, because like we said before a couple of weeks ago, probably last week or a couple of weeks ago, Everything is based, power is based off of sex. A lot of power dynamics are alluded back to sex, particularly the missionary position, where the man is on top and the woman is on the bottom when it comes to heteronormative sex, heterosexual sex. And due to this system of heteronormativity that we live in as Westerners, okay, within this context, okay, and this also concept also can translate to Eastern cultures and etc. However, I want to make sure this is centered for the point of this week's conversation. So within Western traditions, heterosexuality is seen as the norm, there where we get heteronormativity. So if a man is known to take the position of less, meaning being on the bottom instead of the top, regardless of what sexual position that is, he is seen to have no self-control because he is either allowing a woman or another man to be on top of him. And that is a no-no when it comes to hetero-patriarchal socialization, when it comes to hetero-patriarchal concepts of masculinity. According to hetero-patriarchal concepts of masculinity, a man is always supposed to be on top. This is a patriarchy. You're the man. You're supposed to be on top. If you're not on top, you're not resembling patriarchy in your private sphere. So again, let's make sure that we're centering queer sex here. If a man allows another man to penetrate him, that would mean that he has no sexual self-control because he is allowing another man into his corporal entity. Corporal is a fancy word for body. He's allowing another man to penetrate his body. If he has that lack of self-control to allow another man to penetrate his body, then that means his body is penetrable. And that is a no-no within cis heteropatriarchal society. If his body is penetrable, that means that he has no control over his emotions. That's why one of the defining characteristics of masculinity is being unemotional. If you show emotions, if you cry, that's why many of you probably heard the saying, okay, boys aren't supposed to cry. If you cry, if you show emotion too much, even too much excitement, too much joy, too much love for another person, let alone sadness, oh, you are seen as less than a man within hetero patriarchal society because you are allowing too much leakage to flow from your body, that leakage being emotions. So if you allow another man, even another woman, to penetrate your body as a man, if you allow yourself to express too much emotion in abundance, you have no self-control over your body. If you have no sexual self-control and no emotional self-control either, then that means you have no control over your finances. How are people supposed to trust this hypothetical man who has no self-control in the bedroom or with his emotions with financing the country, with financing a department, with financing leadership, with financing the military, when you practice no self-control in your private realm? It doesn't connect, okay? So, if a man has shown to show no self-control with his emotions in his body, then he has no control over his finances. He will be spending ludicrously on any and everything. People tend to like shiny things, shiny, expensive things, because they feel like it sets them apart from the rest of the populace. However, if you spend too frivolously on things, material things or experiences, you're seen as having no self-control. That goes into the political realm. If you have no self-control over your body, over your emotions, or even over your own money, then you will not have self-control when it comes to leading and protecting a nation. If you will allow another man to penetrate your body, you will allow the enemy to come into your nation. So everything from the private sphere connects to the public sphere. And that's how another reason that queer sexuality is demonized within heteropatriarchal society. Because if you are willing to let another entity, especially another man, enter your male body, you are seen as having no control over your body. And if you don't have control over your body, how can you protect and control a nation? These are the thought processes and ideologies of heteropatriarchal societies. Self-control is key to this concept of masculinity, which is a byproduct of patriarchy. Let's continue. So you have, with all that in mind, you have this concept called the prime directive of masculine sexual behavior. According to this concept, a man must always, regardless if he is engaged in heterosexual or homosexual sex, a man must always be the inserter within sex, must always be the one penetrating, must always be the one on top. If he's not, he better act like it. That's literally within the definition. Literally and or figuratively being the insertee of within sexual intercourse, okay? The prime directive of masculine behavior. Because if a man is on top, if he's doing the penetrating, then he is maintaining his status as a man. In the private realm, which we have just learned will almost always connect to the public realm. Now, with that comes the rule of masculine self-restraint that connects right back to the idea of self-control. Now, one of the defining characteristics of hegemonic, meaning dominant, hegemonic masculinity is a man is sexual. A man is sexual. He will not turn down sex. That's the idea of hegemonic heterosexual masculinity. However, there's a caveat here. You must always practice some sort of self-restraint. Sex is fine, but too much sex where you're not getting your business done. Business as in your politics, your finances, making sure your emotional state stays stable. If that's not being, let's see here, regulated, kept under control, then your degree of masculinity by your collective, by your community, is seen as less than. You are not as masculine as you may be led to believe if you have no self-control over your body, over your sex. So this leads into top-bottom sexual politics. Here's how the topic of Latin American men connect to all of these concepts that we have to build off of first. You have what is known as activo, passivo. Now, activo is the partner, just two men. So the activo is the partner who is doing the inserting, who is doing the penetrating, okay? Now, the penetrator is seen as normal, seen as a hegemonically masculine man. And even though he's having sex with another man, he's still seen as masculine and not, quote, truly gay, end quote. However, when you have the passivo, the man who is being penetrated, the man who is on the bottom, he is seen as effeminate, womanly, feminine, because he is taking the position of a woman, which is literally and figuratively at the bottom in terms of sexual positioning, in terms of being on the receiving end, in terms of being on the bottom level of hegemonic patriarchal society, the bottom of the food chain. Here's the ideology. Here's the ideological question here when it comes from those who run patriarchy. How can you be a man? How can you expect your collective to see you as a man when you are literally taking the sexual position as a woman by being on the receiving end? That doesn't characterize true masculinity, according to hegemonic heteropatriarchal society. That's not being a man. So where you have activo men, who will penetrate another man in Latin culture, they'll still be seen as men. Oh, as long as you're the one doing the penetrating, you're still seen as men. You still get to have your masculine status. However, if you are seen and heard of and thought of as the receiving partner in same sex, same gender sex, you are seen as passivo, as not a man. And even these men are pressured and conditioned and encouraged to appear more feminine in their appearance, to be and seem, walk, talk more like women, what's thought of to be feminine. Okay? So that's how Latin culture connects to and informs all and enlivens all of these topics that we just examined here. Now, just to do a whole turnaround, a holistic measure and examination, we also have the concept of MSN, which stands for men who have sex with men. Now, men can have sex with other men and still identify as heterosexual. We talked about this during the first week. Sexuality is not only the act of sex, but also the identity. Again, it's called identity for a reason. Not we identity, not they identity, not family identity. It's called identity. Only you can identify yourself. So within public health discourses, people want to make sure that they will retain their labels, okay, in order to keep up with people's sexual behavior, sexual practices, and how behavioral practices in a community may correlate with health disparities, okay, in particular segments of that community. So in order to categorize these men who identify as heterosexual but still have sex with men, they're called men who have sex with men, basically labeling men on what they do besides of depending on self-identification, okay? So the same thing also goes with WSW, women who have sex with women, heterosexual identified women, but they still have sex with the women. So make sure to keep that in mind. These are two distinct topics when it comes to delineation between activo and passivo and MSN, all right? Good.